This presentation is on the poet and playwright Christopher Marlowe. Marlowe was born in 1564. This is actually the same year that William Shakespeare was born. Just a couple months separate the two men. And that's interesting because Marlowe would not live past the age of 29, and his fame, um, by the time he died in 1593, he was already quite famous. And Shakespeare, who was the same age, was just getting started in 1593. So Marlowe's fame was quite meteoric. His reputation developed much quicker. Shakespeare's career was much slower for different reasons. He was born in Canterbury, Marlowe was, to a shoemaker named John Marlowe and his wife, Catherine. And these humble origins are interesting because by the time Marlowe is in his early 20s, he is connected to the most powerful people in England. And there's a lot of mystery surrounding that. How did Marlowe go from being the son of a shoemaker in Kent to being connected to the Queen's Privy Council when he was in his early 20s and still a college student? So there's a lot of mystery surrounding that. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Um, he was educated at one of England's public schools. At the time, the bureaucracy of government um, was growing, and there was a need for talented, educated, literate men. And so at the time, there were educational reforms that allowed middle class um, middle class boys to be educated in public schools. Schools were no longer limited to preparing young men for careers in the clergy. Apparently, he was quite a precocious student because by the 1580s, he is attending Cambridge on a scholarship, and that scholarship was intended for students preparing to embark on a career in the ministry with the Church of England. While at Cambridge, he was studying the ancient languages, as all ecclesiastics did. So he was exposed to Latin poets like Ovid, and I mention Ovid specifically because of that poet's influence um, on Marlowe's own poetry, in particular Hero and Leander. And Marlowe also translated some of Ovid's poetry, some of his erotic poetry, which, when it was published in the 1590s, created quite a lot of controversy. In 1587, he qualifies for a Master of Arts degree, which is at first denied to him. And this is where the mystery of Marlowe really begins. He qualifies for the degree, and then it's denied because the Cambridge authorities apparently find out that he was planning to join or had joined a group of dissident English Catholics in France. Um, this kind of association would have disqualified him for a career in the English church. It would have disqualified him for any kind of public office. So this was a big deal. Um, and then mysteriously, the Queen's Privy Council sends a letter to the school saying, "Leave Marlowe alone. Give him his degree. He's been." And I'm quoting from the letter here, he's been employed in matters touching the benefit of his country. There's a lot of speculation about what that statement actually meant. One of the most popular theories is that Marlowe was working as a spy or a double agent, that perhaps because of his humble origins and his middle class background, he would have been inconspicuous, and perhaps he was recruited by this man, Francis Walsingham, who was essentially the Queen's Secretary of State, and was the spy master. He headed all espionage operations, spying on Catholics, spying on um, uh, other groups in England and on the continent in Europe. And perhaps this man because of Marlowe's clear intelligence and also his background, he was recruited perhaps to be a spy. That's the most popular theory. So perhaps the authorities at Cambridge did not know that this was all top secret, and so they thought he was associating with these Catholics, and maybe Marlowe was a double agent and was actually spying on them. In any case, while all this is going on, somehow he's got the time to write poetry and write plays. In 1587, he completes his first major literary achievement, which is the play Tamburlaine. And actually, he wrote a sequel to it. It was so popular. And he wrote it in blank verse, so unrhymed iambic pentameter. He was not the first, of course, to write in iambic or blank verse. We saw that Surrey had translated part of Virgil's epic poem, the Aeneid, into blank verse sometime earlier. But Marlowe's contribution to English drama was the blank verse line. The later playwright Ben Jonson, he referred to it as Marlowe's mighty line, and this was Marlowe's contribution to Elizabethan drama. So blank verse became the standard. Shakespeare would write his plays in blank verse. The play Tamburlaine was performed by the Admiral's Men Company in London. The Admiral's Men was probably the second, most important theater company, rivaling Shakespeare's company at the time, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, starting in the 1590s, the mid 1590s. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Admiral's Men a little later in this presentation. In 1589, he gets involved in a brawl with someone named William Bradley, and Marlowe was with his friend, another poet. His name was Thomas Watson, and Watson gets involved in the fight and winds up killing Bradley. Both poets are briefly jailed, but they get off on a plea of self-defense. And this story is interesting because of how Marlowe dies a few years later. And it contributes to this mystique of Marlowe as a poet who hangs out in taverns and gets in brawls. By this time, he has written his poem Hero and Leander, and probably also has completed his translations of Ovid, which get published shortly after. In 1592, he is arrested in Flushing. This is where Sidney was governor in the mid 1580s, and Sidney, you'll remember, was married to Francis Walsingham's daughter. So there's a odd connection between Sidney and Marlowe, that Marlowe may have been employed by Walsingham as a spy, and Sidney was married to his daughter. He's arrested in Flushing for counterfeiting English currency as part of a Catholic plot to undermine the British government. Now, whether or not Marlowe was trying to undermine the British government or was actually working as a double agent who was infiltrating some Catholic organization who was involved in this counterfeiting conspiracy, we don't exactly know. He got out of it, but rumors began swirling around Marlowe at this time. And he's accused of a variety of capital offenses, including atheism, sodomy, and libel against Protestant refugees in London. By 1592, his career is pretty much complete. He's written his major plays, The Jew of Malta, Edward II, Dr. Faustus, I already mentioned earlier, Tamburlaine. And in 1593, he is killed. He was arrested again and summoned this time by the Queen's Privy Council to account for the scandals that were circulating about him. But before he can testify, he is stabbed to death, stabbed in the head at a tavern in Deptford, which was a suburb of London, is on the south bank across the River Thames from the main city. Allegedly, he was stabbed over an unpaid bill, but there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there that that's not really what happened, that this was just a cover, that Marlowe was deliberately assassinated because of what he knew and because of his connections. There's another theory that Marlowe didn't actually die, that this whole thing was faked, and that Marlowe continued to live and write plays. Some people at one time even thought that Marlowe was really Shakespeare, which is an interesting theory. We can talk a little bit now about Dr. Faustus. This is what you see on the right is the title page for a 1620 quarto edition of Dr. Faustus. A very famous image there of Dr. Faustus standing in his magic circle with Mephistopheles down in the bottom right, addressing him. Marlowe probably got the idea for this play from reading a 1592 English translation of an anonymously authored German chapbook that contained stories of an actual man named Johann Faust, who was a 16th century magician and alchemist. There's evidence that the translations of these stories actually were published before 1592, so maybe Marlowe was writing Dr. Faustus in the late 1580s. We don't really know for sure, but we do have a copy of this chapbook from 1592. The play was never published in Marlowe's lifetime, and nor was it performed until after his death. It does appear in the repertory of the Admiral's Men, and which is the theater company that I mentioned earlier, and was regularly performed at the Rose Theatre, one of the great theaters in London at the time. This man, Edward Allen, was the lead actor of the Admiral's Men Theater Company, and he performed all of the lead roles in Marlowe's plays. We know that he played Tamburlaine. We know that he played Dr. Faustus, and he was probably the first or second most famous or well-known actor in England in the 1590s. Richard Burbage with Shakespeare's Company would have been the other prominent actor. Shakespeare's Company was called the Lord Chamberlain's Men. The earliest paper edition of Dr. Faustus was printed in 1604 by a man named Valentine Sims. He was quite respected for his work at the time, a very, very well-known printer, and he'd already printed a number of Shakespeare's plays by this time. And this version is known as the A text of the play, 1604. And that's the version that we're using in this class, and it's the version that is closest to Marlowe, just in terms of chronology. A second version called the B text appeared in 1616, which also happens to be the year that Shakespeare died. And this latter version of Dr. Faustus is considerably longer, has a lot more material in it, and scholars believe that some of that material was not written by Marlowe, but was added by later playwrights as the play circulated through the repertory of the Admiral's Men. But we also know that even the A text has lines that could not have been written by Christopher Marlowe because they refer to people and events that had not occurred until after he died. So there's a lot of disagreement among scholars over which version is actually closer to Marlowe's lost original. So some questions to think about as you read the play is, one is what does Dr. Faustus hope to accomplish? He makes this deal with Lucifer. In exchange for his soul, he gets all this power. What does he want to do with it? And to what extent does he succeed or fail in accomplishing these things? The second question I want you to think about is how might a reader today relate to the story? The spiritual lesson of the play is pretty obvious, I think. But what practical lessons does it contain? How can someone reading the play today, what can you take from it that you can apply to your life, essentially? So think about these questions, and we will use them for discussion later. And that concludes the presentation on Christopher Marlowe and Dr. Faustus.